Late in 1944, the war in Europe was nearing its final stages. The Allies had pushed across France and Belgium after the Normandy landings, driving German forces back toward their own borders. Many German soldiers were captured in the chaos of retreat. These men, weary and defeated, were loaded onto trains and sent across the Atlantic. Their destination was unknown to them. The only thing they had were rumors and memories of the propaganda they had been fed for years. That propaganda warned them of brutal treatment by Allied soldiers, especially Americans. They were told that once captured, they would face starvation, beatings, and humiliation. For many of these men, the prospect of capture was terrifying, and they expected the worst. The journey across the ocean was long and cold. The prisoners were guarded by U.S. troops during the voyage. Food was rationed but steady, and no one was mistreated, though the German soldiers stayed quiet, suspicious of every gesture. When they finally reached American soil, they were loaded onto trains for the final leg of the trip. The landscape outside the train windows was unfamiliar. Rolling plains and stretches of farmland passed by, a stark contrast to the ruins of European towns they had left behind. Snow clung to the fields, and the air was bitterly cold. They were entering the heart of the American Midwest. The train stopped near a large fenced area. This was a prisoner of war camp, one of many scattered across the United States. These camps were built according to U.S. Army regulations and followed strict guidelines laid out in the Geneva Convention. Guard towers stood at each corner. The perimeter was lined with barbed wire. Rows of wooden barracks filled the center, surrounded by open space to keep escape attempts visible. Watchlights illuminated the grounds as night fell, casting long shadows over the compound. Trucks idled near the entrance, waiting to move supplies and men. The German prisoners were ordered off the train. They climbed down carefully, carrying small bundles of personal belongings. Some had photos tucked into their coat pockets, others clutched worn blankets. Their boots were worn thin from months of marching and retreating. The scene was tense. The prisoners looked around nervously, scanning the camp for signs of hostility. In their minds, this was the moment when the cruelty they had been warned about would begin. They expected shouts, fists, maybe even rifle butts to the ribs. Instead, what they encountered left them silent and confused. The American guards who met them at the platform were calm and organized. Their uniforms were clean and well-kept, their rifles slung casually at their sides. One guard stepped forward, not to bark orders, but to hold out a metal pot filled with steaming coffee. Another reached into his jacket and pulled out a pack of cigarettes. The offer was simple: a cup of coffee, a cigarette to take the edge off the cold. At first, the German soldiers froze in place, unsure if this was a trick. They glanced at each other, waiting for someone to move first. Finally, one man stepped forward and accepted the cup. He took a cautious sip, his hands trembling. The warmth spread through him, and his eyes widened with disbelief. Others followed, one by one, until the whole group was gathered around the guards, clutching cups of coffee, lighting cigarettes with matches provided by their captors. The tension broke in an instant. There was no shouting, no violence, just a quiet exchange between men who, hours before, had been on opposite sides of a battlefield. Some of the Germans muttered in their own language, their voices low and bewildered. They spoke of the lies they had been told, the images of barbaric Americans that now seemed ridiculous. For the first time, they allowed themselves to relax, if only slightly. The fear that had gripped them since their capture began to fade. A few even smiled, though cautiously, as they warmed their hands over the coffee cups. The camp itself operated with precision. Each prisoner was registered, given a bunk, and provided with basic supplies. Blankets, food, and soap were issued. The guards maintained order through discipline rather than aggression. They were instructed to treat the prisoners according to the rules of war. This was not done out of sentimentality but out of strategy and law. By following the Geneva Convention, the United States set an example for the world and hoped to encourage similar treatment for American prisoners held overseas. It was also a practical matter. Well-treated prisoners were less likely to revolt or attempt escape, reducing the risk to the guards and surrounding communities. Inside the barracks, the prisoners found clean, if sparse, accommodations. Wooden bunks lined the walls. The air smelled of fresh lumber and coal smoke from the nearby stove. After months of mud, hunger, and battle, the simple comfort of a warm, dry place to sleep felt surreal. Some prisoners sat in silence, staring at the walls. Others spoke quietly about their families back home, wondering when they might see them again. The shock of their arrival still lingered. They had been prepared for pain and degradation. Instead, they were met with a strange kind of dignity. Outside, the guards went about their duties. Many were young men from nearby towns, farm boys and factory workers who had enlisted early in the war. To them, the prisoners were just men, soldiers like themselves, caught in a conflict far larger than either side could control. The coffee and cigarettes were a small gesture, but one that carried weight. It set the tone for the relationship between captor and captive. Over time, this initial moment of kindness would grow into something more. Work details were organized, and prisoners were allowed to help with farm labor or maintenance around the camp. Trust slowly and carefully began to form. In those first hours, though, none of that was certain. What was certain was the immediate impact of that first act of humanity. For the German soldiers, it was a moment they would remember for the rest of their lives. For the American guards, it was simply another day on duty. Yet together, they created an exchange that defied the expectations of war. The prisoner of war camp was built to meet the standards laid out by the U.S. Army and the Geneva Convention. Its layout was simple but effective. A tall fence wrapped around the entire area, reinforced with barbed wire strung in multiple rows to make climbing or cutting difficult. At each corner stood a wooden guard tower high enough to give sentries a clear view of the grounds and the surrounding terrain. These towers were equipped with searchlights and rifles, tools meant to deter escape attempts rather than to intimidate. The towers were spaced so that no blind spots existed along the fence line. At night, the lights swept slowly over the camp, casting long shadows over the packed earth. Inside the perimeter were rows of wooden barracks arranged with precision. Each barracks could house dozens of prisoners. The buildings were basic but sturdy, built with timber and lined with bunks along both sides. A central walkway ran down the middle, wide enough for men to pass through in single file. The air inside smelled of wood, smoke, and sweat. Coal stoves provided heat during the cold months. Windows were small and set high in the walls to prevent anyone from crawling through. Between the barracks stood larger buildings used for administration, storage, and medical care. A mess hall sat near the center of the camp, with long wooden tables where meals were served in shifts. Everything was arranged for efficiency, making it easier to control the movement of hundreds of men. The entrance to the camp was a wide gate guarded at all times. This was where new prisoners arrived and where supplies were delivered. Trucks came and went carrying food, clothing, and fuel. Each delivery was logged, every item accounted for. Record-keeping was strict. The U.S. military treated the management of prisoners like any other military operation. When prisoners were brought in, they were processed with precision. Names, ranks, and unit information were recorded in ledgers and filed in the camp's administrative office. Each prisoner was assigned to a barracks and issued basic supplies: blankets, soap, and utensils. The paperwork created a clear chain of responsibility, ensuring no man went unaccounted for. The daily routine followed a set schedule. At dawn, guards walked through the barracks to wake the prisoners. Roll call was taken in the open yard, where men lined up in neat rows while officers checked names against the records. Breakfast was served in the mess hall, usually simple meals like bread, porridge, and coffee. After breakfast, work details were organized. Some prisoners were assigned to tasks inside the camp, such as cleaning, repairs, or tending the gardens. Others were sent to nearby farms or factories under guard to assist with labor shortages caused by the war. These work programs were not only practical but also part of the strategy to keep prisoners occupied and less likely to cause trouble. Cigarettes and coffee played an important role in camp life. These small comforts were inexpensive for the military to provide, but they had a powerful effect on morale. Guards understood that a prisoner with a cigarette in his hand was calmer and less likely to stir unrest. Coffee served in tin cups during cold mornings made the daily routine more tolerable. These gestures were not acts of friendship, but they created a sense of order. By offering small tokens of normal life, the guards reinforced discipline without relying on threats or violence. The rules that governed the camp were clear and based on international law. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment of prisoners. This meant they had to be given adequate food, shelter, and medical care. Physical punishment was forbidden except in cases of severe violations like attempted escape or acts of violence. American guards were trained to follow these rules strictly. Before being assigned to duty at a camp, each guard went through briefings where the policies were explained in detail. They were told why the rules mattered, both morally and strategically. The United States wanted to show the world that it adhered to the laws of war. Good treatment of prisoners was also used as leverage. By treating captured German soldiers well, the U.S. hoped American prisoners in German camps would receive similar care in return. The guards themselves came from different backgrounds. Many were young men drafted from rural towns or small cities across the Midwest. Some had never left their home state before the war. Others were veterans who had served overseas and were now rotated back for less dangerous assignments. Their job required discipline and vigilance. They were armed, but their weapons were rarely raised. The goal was control through presence, not force. A guard walking his post was expected to remain alert and calm, ready to respond but not provoke. Escape attempts were rare but always taken seriously. The camp's design made it difficult for anyone to slip away unnoticed. The open space between the barracks and the fence created a clear line of sight for the towers. Dogs were sometimes used to patrol the outer perimeter at night. If an escape did occur, alarms were sounded, and search parties were dispatched immediately. Punishment for escapees was firm but stayed within the limits of the law. The emphasis was always on maintaining order rather than creating fear. Medical care was another important aspect of camp life. A small infirmary staffed by military medics handled routine illnesses and minor injuries. Serious cases were sent to nearby hospitals under guard. German prisoners were treated the same as American soldiers in need of care. This policy was another way to uphold the standards set by the Geneva Convention. It also served a practical purpose. Healthy prisoners could work and maintain the routines of the camp, while sick prisoners could become a source of unrest. Communication with the outside world was tightly controlled. Prisoners were allowed to send and receive letters, but these were censored to prevent the spread of sensitive information. Mail was inspected by camp officials before being delivered. Packages containing food or clothing from families in Germany were also checked. These measures kept security intact while allowing prisoners some connection to home. The camp functioned like a small military town. It had its own hierarchy, routines, and systems. Every detail, from the placement of the towers to the distribution of cigarettes, was designed with a purpose. The goal was to hold thousands of enemy soldiers in one place safely and efficiently, while still following the rules that separated lawful armies from the brutality of unchecked war. The train whistle echoed across the flat winter landscape as the line of cars slowed to a stop near the camp. A cold wind swept over the fields, carrying the smell of coal smoke from the engine. Inside the boxcars, German prisoners stirred from a restless sleep. They had been packed into the cars for days, riding in silence, speaking only in low tones. Their faces were thin and pale, their uniforms torn and dirty from weeks of retreat and battle. Each man clutched a small bundle of belongings: a photo of a wife or child, a dented tin cup, a worn blanket. They had been captured in France and Belgium during the last Allied offensives and had been shipped thousands of miles away to a place none of them knew. The sound of boots and shouted orders reached them as the doors slid open. Bright daylight poured in, blinding after the dim interior. The prisoners squinted and raised their hands to shield their eyes. Outside, armed American guards stood in formation. The guards wore heavy winter coats, rifles slung over their shoulders. They waited without speaking as the prisoners climbed down, one at a time, into the snow-dusted yard. The ground was frozen hard, crunching under their boots. The men expected violence. They had been told countless stories by their officers about the cruelty of American soldiers. Nazi propaganda had painted a clear picture. Captured soldiers would be beaten, starved, and worked to death. Some of the older men had been through World War I and remembered harsh conditions in British and French camps. Now, as they stepped onto American soil, they were certain worse treatment awaited them. A few muttered to one another in German, voices tight with fear. "Stay together," one prisoner whispered. Another glanced nervously at the guards and said, "Watch their hands. If they raise their rifles, run." The camp loomed ahead. Barbed wire glistened with frost, looping high around the perimeter. Guard towers rose above the fence, their silhouettes stark against the gray sky. Searchlights hung motionless in the daylight but promised vigilance when night fell. The layout suggested total control. It was a place built to contain and to dominate. The prisoners' pace slowed as they approached the gates. Some lowered their heads, bracing for insults or blows. A voice called out in English, firm but calm. A sergeant gave instructions to line up in rows. The orders were translated by another guard who spoke some German. The prisoners obeyed without hesitation. There was no shouting, only the sound of boots shifting on the frozen ground. Then something unexpected happened. A young guard walked forward carrying a metal pot. Steam rose from its spout, curling into the cold air. Behind him, another guard carried a tray stacked with tin cups. Without ceremony, the first guard poured a cup and held it out to the nearest prisoner. The German froze, staring at the cup as if it were a trick. "Take it," the guard said simply. The prisoner hesitated, then reached out with a trembling hand. He sniffed the contents and realized it was coffee, hot and strong. His eyes widened. At the same time, a second guard opened a pack of cigarettes and offered one to another prisoner. Matches were passed around. Soon, a few thin streams of smoke rose above the line of men. The smell of tobacco mixed with the sharp winter air. For a moment, no one spoke. The scene felt unreal. These prisoners had expected harsh words and raised rifle butts. Instead, they were being given warmth and a small taste of normal life. Confusion rippled through the group. Some exchanged uncertain glances. A few whispered to each other. "Are they mocking us?" one asked quietly. "Why are they doing this?" another replied. No one had an answer. One by one, more men accepted cups of coffee and lit cigarettes. The tension began to ease, though wariness remained. The initial fear softened into something closer to relief. The prisoners began to realize there would be no beatings today, no public humiliation. The guards remained professional, moving with quiet efficiency. They did not smile or joke, but they also did not threaten. They checked each man against a roster, noting names and ranks. Blankets were handed out to those who needed them. Inside the camp, the prisoners were led toward the barracks. As they walked, some sipped their coffee in silence. Others looked around at their new surroundings. The barracks were plain wooden buildings, smoke rising from stoves inside. They were clean and orderly, a stark contrast to the filth and chaos of the battlefield. One guard, speaking in broken German, told the prisoners they would be given food and rest before being assigned work details. His tone was even, without malice. The words were simple, but their meaning was profound. These men, who had been taught to see Americans as enemies beyond reason, were now being treated according to rules they had not believed existed. In the mess hall, lunch was served in shifts. The food was basic but plentiful. Stew, bread, and more coffee. The prisoners ate cautiously at first, expecting some hidden cruelty. When none came, their shoulders began to relax. A few dared to speak more openly. One older soldier, seated near the end of a table, murmured, "Back home, they told us we would die in chains. Look at this. It's nothing like they said." Another nodded. "If this is a prison, it is not the one we were warned about." The guards observed from a distance, maintaining order without interfering. They knew that this first day would set the tone for the months ahead. By treating the prisoners with a firm hand and a measure of respect, they reduced the chance of unrest. As night fell, the camp settled into its routine. The watchlights switched on, casting circles of brightness across the yard. The towers stood silent, their silhouettes sharp against the darkening sky. Inside the barracks, the prisoners lay on their bunks, processing the day's events. For many, the shock had yet to fade. They were far from home, held by the enemy, yet spared the cruelty they had been taught to expect. That single act of offering coffee and cigarettes had cracked the wall of fear built up over years of war and propaganda. It was a small gesture, but one that carried weight far beyond its simplicity. The first nights in the camp were the hardest for the German prisoners. They lay on their bunks staring at the wooden ceiling, the sounds of the barracks settling around them. Some wept quietly, muffling their sobs in blankets. Others stared into the dark, thinking of their families and homes far away. The shock of capture and the long journey had worn them down, but it was the treatment they received on arrival that unsettled them most. They had prepared themselves for cruelty and hunger. Instead, they were given food, warmth, and respect. It was a kindness they did not understand. For years, they had been told that Americans were ruthless and barbaric. Propaganda posters back home had shown grotesque images of enemies who would murder them without hesitation. In the trenches and on the march, officers had repeated these warnings to keep them fighting. Now, faced with guards who offered coffee and cigarettes, many prisoners began to question what they had been taught. They whispered to each other late at night, voices low to avoid being overheard. "If this is how they treat us," one young soldier said, "what else have we been lied to about?" An older man, a veteran of the early campaigns, shook his head. "We were told we were defending our homes from monsters. But these men, they are just soldiers like us." These conversations spread quietly through the camp. Some prisoners held on to their anger, refusing to speak to the guards or even to each other. Others began to soften, their certainty about the war and their leaders eroding day by day. The guards watched this change with a careful eye. Most of them were young, no older than the prisoners they were guarding. Many had come from small towns and farms in the Midwest. Before the war, they had never met anyone from Germany, let alone fought against them. To these Americans, the prisoners were no longer faceless enemies. They were men wearing worn uniforms, shivering in the cold, missing their families just as the guards missed theirs. At first, the guards kept their distance. Orders were clear: maintain discipline, follow protocol, and avoid unnecessary contact. But over time, small interactions began to happen. A guard would help a prisoner fix a broken button on his coat. A prisoner would thank a guard in halting English after receiving an extra cup of coffee. These moments were simple, yet they chipped away at the wall between captor and captive. One cold evening, a guard named Thomas stood watch near the gate. A German prisoner approached slowly, carrying a letter he had written to his wife. The man spoke no English, but through gestures and a few shared words, he asked if the letter would be sent home. Thomas nodded and pointed to the mail sack. As the prisoner handed over the letter, he pulled a small photo from his pocket. It showed a woman holding a baby. He said the names softly in German, his voice trembling. Thomas understood without needing a translation. He reached into his own coat and pulled out a picture of his wife and newborn son. For a moment, the two men stood side by side, each looking at the other's photo. No words were spoken. Both nodded, a silent recognition passing between them. Then the prisoner returned to his barracks, and Thomas resumed his watch. These brief exchanges reminded the guards of their shared humanity. Many began to see the prisoners not as a threat but as men caught in a war they had not chosen. The discipline of the camp never wavered, but the atmosphere shifted. When orders were given, they were spoken with authority, not cruelty. When punishments were handed out for rule violations, they were measured and fair. The prisoners noticed these differences. They compared the behavior of the American guards to the treatment they had received from their own officers. Back in Europe, discipline had been enforced through fear. Beatings and public humiliation were common. Here, punishment was firm but not degrading. That contrast struck deep. One afternoon, a work detail returned from a nearby farm where they had spent the day harvesting crops. The men were tired but talkative. As they lined up for roll call, one prisoner spoke quietly to another. Back home, our prisoners would never be allowed to work like this. They would be beaten. Here, they give us food and let us rest. It makes no sense. His companion replied, maybe that is why they are winning this war. They fight with more than just weapons. The guards, too, found themselves reflecting on what they were seeing. At first, some had struggled with anger. Many had friends or family who had been killed overseas. It was hard to look at the German prisoners without resentment. But as the weeks passed, that anger dulled. They began to realize that these men were not the ones who had made the decisions that led to war. They were soldiers following orders just like them. During quiet moments, guards and prisoners exchanged bits of language. A few words of English here, a few words of German there. They learned how to ask for water, to say thank you, to give directions. These small lessons broke down barriers. The camp doctor, who treated both guards and prisoners, noticed the change in demeanor. Early on, he had seen prisoners refuse care, suspicious of every gesture. Later, they came willingly, trusting that they would be treated with the same attention as anyone else. The doctor recorded these observations in his reports, noting how morale improved when basic respect was shown. Winter turned to spring, and the routine of camp life settled in. The initial shock faded, but its effects remained. Many prisoners carried a quiet sense of guilt. They thought about the civilians and soldiers they had fought against, wondering how many had suffered because of the lies they had believed. Some began to imagine a different future, one where the hatred they had been taught no longer ruled their lives. The guards, too, were changed by the experience. They learned that empathy could be as powerful as force. A simple act, a shared cigarette, a nod of understanding, could turn an enemy into a human being. In the midst of a global war, these small connections became a reminder of what they were fighting to preserve. The days after the prisoners arrived set the tone for the entire camp. The simple act of offering coffee and cigarettes had broken through fear and anger. Word spread quickly among the prisoners that the Americans were not the brutal enemy they had been told to expect. This change in perception had an immediate effect. Prisoners began to follow orders without resistance. Roll calls went smoothly, and work details left the camp each morning without trouble. Guards no longer needed to rely on threats or shows of force to maintain control. The camp commander reported fewer incidents of disobedience or attempted escape than expected. The prisoners realized there was no need to risk their lives trying to flee. They were fed well, given shelter, and allowed to send letters home. Some even began to volunteer for extra work assignments. Farmers in the surrounding area faced severe labor shortages due to so many young men being away at war. Under strict supervision, groups of prisoners were sent to help harvest crops, mend fences, and care for livestock. In nearby towns, prisoners worked in sawmills, canneries, and factories that produced essential goods for the war effort. Though they were still captives, their labor filled critical gaps in the economy. This arrangement benefited both sides. The prisoners received small wages credited to their accounts, which they could use to buy extra food or toiletries from the camp store. The work kept them occupied and gave them a sense of purpose. For the U.S. military and local communities, the added labor eased wartime pressures without requiring more American manpower. It also strengthened discipline inside the camp. Prisoners who worked outside were less likely to cause trouble once they returned. The approach was deliberate. The U.S. military understood that treating prisoners humanely was not just a matter of following international law. It was a tactic with real strategic value. By offering dignity and basic comforts, they encouraged cooperation. A content prisoner was easier to manage than one who felt desperate or abused. Guards learned quickly that small gestures, a warm meal, clean clothes, a few words spoken respectfully, could prevent unrest better than barbed wire or rifles alone. As weeks turned to months, the atmosphere inside the camp stabilized. Guards and prisoners established a rhythm. Disputes were handled calmly through established rules rather than force. The camp became efficient, almost self-sustaining. Food supplies were managed carefully, medical needs were met, and security procedures were followed without friction. The prisoners knew what to expect, and the guards knew how to maintain order without unnecessary confrontation. Beyond the camp's fences, the effect reached even further. Farmers who worked alongside German prisoners began to see them differently. They realized these men were skilled workers, many of them coming from farming families in Germany. Stories began to circulate in nearby towns about the surprising behavior of the prisoners. Instead of the dangerous enemy depicted in newspapers and radio broadcasts, they were described as polite, hardworking, and grateful for fair treatment. This created an unexpected form of psychological warfare. When the prisoners were eventually returned to Germany after the war, they carried their experiences with them. They told their families and neighbors about the humane conditions they had seen in American camps. These accounts directly contradicted years of Nazi propaganda that had portrayed the Allies as savage and merciless. The stories spread quietly but powerfully, undermining the credibility of the regime that had deceived them. Some returning prisoners spoke about their time in captivity in ways that surprised those at home. They described clean barracks, organized routines, and guards who followed rules instead of acting on hatred. They talked about work programs that allowed them to earn small wages and maintain a sense of dignity. Many admitted that these experiences made them question what they had fought for and why. This ripple effect reached into the post-war years. Former prisoners who had seen the United States firsthand were less likely to view America as an enemy during the rebuilding of Germany. When the war ended and Germany was divided into occupied zones, trust was in short supply. The stories told by these men became part of a foundation for reconciliation. They helped create a climate where cooperation was possible, especially in areas under American control. For U.S. military planners, this was an unspoken victory. The choice to follow the Geneva Convention strictly had been more than a legal obligation. It had become a weapon in its own right. By showing restraint and humanity, the United States projected strength without cruelty. This image contrasted sharply with reports coming out of German-run camps in Europe, where Allied prisoners often faced starvation, forced labor, and violence. The difference was stark, and it shaped how the world viewed each side when the war ended. Inside the military, officers recognized the practical benefits as well. Cooperative prisoners freed up resources. Fewer guards were needed to maintain security when trust existed between captors and captives. The risk of uprisings or sabotage decreased. The camps ran smoothly, allowing more manpower to be directed toward combat operations overseas. Even intelligence operations benefited. Interrogations were easier when prisoners felt safe. Many shared information willingly, believing they would be treated fairly in return. Details about troop movements, supply lines, and morale inside the German army were gathered not through coercion, but through conversation and careful questioning. This intelligence was valuable in planning the final offensives of the war. The strategic consequences reached beyond immediate military gains. After the war, as Germany lay in ruins, the way prisoners had been treated became part of a larger narrative. It showed that the United States could be both powerful and just. This reputation mattered during the tense early years of the Cold War, when alliances and influence were being reshaped. Former enemies became allies in part because of memories formed in places like that Midwestern camp. What began as a routine decision to offer coffee and cigarettes on a cold morning grew into something much larger. It was a calculated choice that changed the behavior of thousands of men. It turned potential resistance into cooperation. It planted seeds of doubt in the minds of those who had once believed deeply in Nazi propaganda. Most of all, it demonstrated that war was not only fought with weapons and armies, but also with ideas and actions that could echo long after the battles were over. When the war finally ended and the prisoners were released, they returned to a Germany that was almost unrecognizable. Cities lay in ruins, industries destroyed, families scattered. For many former soldiers, there was no home to return to as they had remembered it. The transition from prisoner to free man was difficult, yet the memories of their time in the American camps stayed with them. These experiences shaped the way they viewed the future and their former enemies. Some of the men who had once marched under the banners of the Third Reich began to see the United States differently. The small acts of fairness and dignity they had encountered while in captivity stood in stark contrast to the lies they had been told during the war. They remembered the coffee handed to them on their first day in camp, the clean barracks, the meals served without insult or cruelty. These memories became stories told to friends and family in Germany. Over time, they spread far beyond the individuals who had lived them. A number of former prisoners made a choice that would have seemed unthinkable during the war. They emigrated to the United States. Drawn by the order and decency they had witnessed, they sought new lives in the very country they had once fought against. Some settled on farms in the Midwest, in towns not far from the camps where they had been held. Others moved to cities and built careers in trades they had learned while working under guard. For these men, the war had given them a glimpse of a different kind of future, and they embraced it. Their presence helped to create a living bridge between the two nations, proof that reconciliation was possible. The camps themselves left a mark on the American landscape. Some were dismantled after the war, their structures torn down and their grounds returned to farmland. Others remained for years, repurposed for different uses before finally being closed. Today, a few have been preserved as historical sites. Simple wooden barracks, fences, and guard towers stand as reminders of a complex moment in history. Visitors walk the grounds and imagine the lives of those who once lived behind the wire. Museums display photographs, uniforms, and personal artifacts left behind by prisoners and guards alike. These places serve as a testament to the human dimension of war, a record of what happened when enemies faced each other not with rifles, but with a fragile kind of respect. Military academies and leadership schools study these camps as case studies. The treatment of German prisoners is examined in detail, not just as a logistical success but as an ethical one. Students learn how decisions made by commanders influence behavior on both sides of the wire. They analyze how humane policies reduced conflict and created conditions that benefited the war effort. In these classrooms, the lessons go beyond history. They explore the idea that a soldier's duty includes upholding laws and values, even when dealing with an enemy. The legacy of these camps continues to shape thinking about modern conflicts. International law has evolved since World War II, but the core principles remain the same. Prisoners of war must be treated with dignity, not only because it is right, but because it serves practical ends. Modern military planners often draw parallels between the past and the present. They look at how respect and adherence to rules can prevent radicalization, reduce resistance, and even gather valuable intelligence. The events of the 1940s are cited as evidence that soft power can be as influential as hard power on the battlefield. Former prisoners who remained in Germany often spoke of their time in the camps as a turning point in their lives. For some, it was the first time they had been confronted with the reality that their government had lied to them. These men carried their stories into the rebuilding of their country. They became part of a larger effort to create a democratic society from the ashes of war. Their voices were important in bridging the gap between victors and the defeated. When new institutions were formed, and when Germany began its path toward stability, the memories of fair treatment at the hands of former enemies played a quiet but crucial role. Local communities in the United States also carried memories of this period. Farmers and townspeople who had worked alongside German prisoners during the war recalled the experience with a mix of pride and humility. Many remembered conversations held in broken English and German, shared meals in fields, and the recognition that, beneath the uniforms, these were men who had families and hopes like anyone else. These memories were passed down through generations, adding layers to the understanding of World War II beyond the battles and famous names. In the decades that followed, as Cold War tensions rose and fell, the legacy of humane treatment remained a point of strength for the United States. It stood as proof that a nation could wield immense military power while still holding to a set of principles. Even when new wars broke out and new enemies emerged, the example set by those camps remained a guide. The physical traces of the camps have faded in many places. Fields now grow where prisoners once lined up for roll call. Roads and buildings cover what was once barbed wire and packed earth. Yet the stories endure. Former prisoners wrote memoirs and letters. Families preserved photos and journals. Historians continue to uncover documents that show the careful planning and deliberate choices made by commanders and guards. Every account, no matter how small, adds to a larger narrative. It shows how war is not only about destruction but also about moments when humanity is preserved. a guard offering a cigarette, a prisoner showing a photograph of his child. These simple acts are remembered long after the battles have been forgotten. They remind those who study the past that the line between friend and enemy is not fixed. It can change through action, through choice, and through the quiet power of dignity shown in the face of conflict. This legacy is still relevant. As new wars test the limits of international law, leaders look back to the example set in those Midwestern camps. They see how one decision on a cold morning shaped the behavior of thousands and influenced the relationship between nations for generations. The past becomes a guide for the present, showing that even in the midst of war, the treatment of a prisoner can send a message more powerful than any weapon.